We've reached the meat of Warframe design critique with a frame that probably embodies the most simultaneously frustrating design issues. There's redundancy in Feast and Regurgitate, there's overcomplication and viability conflict in Nourish, and Pulverize removes core gameplay without sufficient trade-off. Grindel's passive grants players armor for each enemy captured by Feast. Let's not beat around the bush. This passive is interesting, but utterly lackluster in terms of effort for the minimal gain. Grindel has to capture enough enemies to make it worthwhile, but wouldn't likely be able to keep it up due to the energy drain. Not to mention, the question of how durable am I would constantly fluctuate as enemies die. Valkyr's Warcry would net a higher armor increase, and that's a flat cost. Why would a player endure attempting to maximize this when quick thinking would make better use of the energy? DE could instead give Grindel bonus armor or damage reduction depending on his maximum energy, and this will make a little bit more sense with my later suggestions. Feast, Grindel's first ability, sucks enemies into some void in Grindel's stomach, stripping a percentage of their armor over time. Holding this will vomit up enemies, dealing toxin damage. The core of this ability isn't terrible, but I wonder if there's a better way to go about it because effectively it's an abstraction to using enemies as energy. Would it not suffice to just have Feast stun enemies and drain a percentage of enemies' health to use as energy? Then allow enemies to be consumed when their health reaches 0 from the damage. And say, when Grindel consumes enemies, they spawn universal orbs and or further increase Grindel's maximum energy. The reason for the change from just eating enemies is that there's mild design concerns and conflicts. First, with Grindel being on an exponential timer, the increased drain, it devalues the ability and makes it hard to control as a player. The same issue can be seen with Hydroid. Just wait until you pull an energy leech Eximus, am I right? It's like the drain is more or less to prevent enemies from being, quote, held hostage inside Grindel where allies can't interact with them. It's a rehash to Nyx's mind control issues. This, to me, feels like players are being punished or limited just because of how the ability is designed. Hear me out. Imagine the difference between Nova's Molecular Prime, Vauban's Bastille and or Vortex, Banshee's Silence. Okay, you see where I'm going with this, right? I'm sorry, I had to. But imagine if other CC abilities drained or charged extra energy per enemy hit. That's essentially what's happening in the case of Grindel and Hydroid. For Nourish, Grindel's second ability, Grindel can now cycle, round of applause for that change, between Nourish, Energy, Armor, and Strike, each version allowing Grindel to heal on cast. Nourish Energy allows players to get a multiplicative increase in energy from all sources. Armor gives Grindel increased armor, and Strike applies toxin damage buff to weapons that applies as elemental mods do. Another round of applause because we can now generally apply our cast preference to cycle abilities. For this cycle ability in particular, however, it seems like there's never a case where I don't want all 3 buffs, and it turns into a timer-staring juggling match worse than Chroma and Octavia combined. I'd argue at the very least that Grindel's passive armor could be increased, and the armor version of this ability wouldn't really be necessary. Equally, all the buffs should just affect allies. Grindel's third ability, Regurgitate, spits an enemy as a toxin projectile, and honestly, let's just keep it simple. I don't like the functionality as it feels like it should just be the alt cast for Feast. I think with the changes to other abilities functionality, however, Regurgitate should be redesigned as it currently acts as a poor energy management tool where players are theoretically supposed to go, oh no, my drain is too high, time to spit out enemies, and I feel like that's not really the case. You could still make it, quote, launch enemy corpses as bombs that leave puddles and have it subtract maximum energy if it's truly desired to maintain the overall effect. Though I'd argue just slapping an energy cost is sufficient enough. Now for Pulverize, which turns Grindel into a massive ball of impact and toxin damage. They've done a lot to improve this ability by allowing Grindel to utilize other abilities in this form, but I'd argue that with Feast being core, the inability to eat enemies using Feast or simply running into them like Pac-Man is a bit of a missed opportunity. Not to mention we get another augment that aims to band-aid the movement issues. Feast could be more like a slash dash during Pulverize that lets Grindel charge forward and eat enemies in a small range around him, or when used in air, devour enemies in a small shockwave. I feel for Grindel's theme, most of the core abilities work without major changes in functionality, but I'd argue his augment Altfire needs to be moved to base functionality minimum. Even if they disable Feast during Pulverize, at least reward players if they manage to run over enemies. I'd argue Regurgitate could be improved by simply leaving a trail and or puddle where Grindel rolls and or slams respectively while Pulverize is active. Here's the crux of so many Warframe design choices that I almost want to make a separate video about it, but we'll start here. Each of Grindel's non-feast abilities hinge on Grindel feasting enemies. That is a negative feedback loop. If you cannot feast, you can't play Grindel. It's like DE have this weird fixation with negative feedback loops. The question is always, how do we stop the player from doing X instead of how do we reward the player for doing Y? What instead should be the case is that Grindel's ability have a value when no enemies are inside his belly, but get more effectiveness or alterations depending on the number of enemies feasted when cast. So for example, being able to cast Pulverize whenever, but being rewarded by growing in size, or having increased durability, or increased devour range by consuming enemies before casting Pulverize feels a lot better as a player, and I don't know how I can make that any more apparent to DE. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to this video. Grindel is fortunately a frame with pretty stable foundations, they just needed to be designed with a bit more positive feedback loop in mind.